The sun was setting over the small southern town, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet streets. Marcus Johnson adjusted his tie as he drove home from work, his mind replaying the details of a case he had just wrapped up in court that day. It had been a long but rewarding week. He'd successfully prosecuted a corrupt official whose actions had harmed countless lives. As a federal prosecutor, Marcus had spent years fighting for justice, often against overwhelming odds. But tonight, he just wanted to relax and enjoy the peaceful drive back to his family. As he turned onto Main Street, Marcus noticed a police car parked near the curb up ahead. He slowed down slightly, making sure to follow all traffic rules. Just then, he changed lanes to avoid a pothole, forgetting to signal in his exhaustion. A split second later, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. His heart sank. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath. Pulling over to the side of the road, Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly. He knew how these situations could go. His friends and colleagues had shared stories about being unfairly targeted because of their race. Still, Marcus reminded himself to stay calm. When the officer approached his window, Marcus rolled it down with a polite smile. "Good evening, officer," he said warmly. "Is there something I can help you with?" The officer didn't return the smile. Instead, he glanced at Marcus's car, taking in its polished exterior and luxury brand, before turning his attention to Marcus himself. His tone was clipped as he asked for Marcus's license and registration. Marcus complied without hesitation, handing over the documents while explaining that he might have forgotten to signal earlier. The officer barely listened, jotting down notes on his clipboard. "Do you know why I pulled you over, sir?" the officer finally asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Marcus nodded patiently. "I believe it's because I failed to signal when changing lanes. If that's correct, I apologize. It wasn't intentional." Despite his calm demeanor, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this stop was about more than just a minor traffic violation. After what felt like an eternity, the officer handed back Marcus's documents along with a ticket. "You'll need to appear in court for this," the officer said curtly, avoiding eye contact. Marcus stared at the slip of paper in disbelief. A court appearance? For such a trivial mistake. He wanted to argue, to point out how ridiculous this seemed, but experience told him that pushing back would only make things worse. So, he simply thanked the officer and drove away, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Later that night, as Marcus sat at his kitchen table staring at the ticket, he thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who faced similar treatment every single day. He knew he couldn't let this slide. Little did he know, this seemingly ordinary traffic stop would set off a chain of events that would challenge not only the local justice system, but also force someone in power to confront their own deeply ingrained biases. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Marcus walked into the small, dimly lit courtroom with a sense of quiet determination. He had dressed impeccably, wearing a sharp navy blue suit that spoke volumes about his professionalism. It wasn't just for show. Marcus wanted to remind everyone present, including the judge, that he was someone who took life seriously and respected authority. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that this case might not be decided on facts alone. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as people waited for Judge Harold Whittaker to enter. Known throughout the county for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, Whittaker commanded both fear and respect. Some locals whispered stories of how he could reduce even the toughest defendants to silence with just a glare. Others muttered complaints about his tendency to favor certain groups over others. Marcus listened carefully, picking up bits and pieces of conversation, while trying to stay focused on the task ahead. When Judge Whittaker finally entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. His gray hair and wrinkled face gave him an air of wisdom, but his piercing eyes carried an unspoken weight. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the room briefly, and then called Marcus's case. As Marcus stood up to approach the bench, he noticed the judge studying him closely, not as a lawyer or a professional, but simply as a black man standing in front of him. "Mr. Johnson," Whittaker began, his tone gruff and dismissive. "You've been charged with failing to signal before changing lanes. Do you admit to this violation?" Marcus nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor, I do. However, it was unintentional, and I believe the circumstances warrant leniency." He went on to explain the situation clearly, emphasizing that he had changed lanes to avoid a pothole and hadn't caused any disruption or danger to other drivers. But Whittaker barely seemed to listen. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "Mr. Johnson," he said sharply, "the law doesn't care about intentions. You broke it, plain and simple. And frankly, I see too many people like you making excuses instead of owning up to their mistakes." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. People like you hung heavy in the air, loaded with implications far beyond the traffic ticket itself. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Your Honor," he replied evenly, "I understand the importance of following the law. I enforce it every day in my own work. My goal here is simply to clarify what happened so we can resolve this matter fairly." Whittaker scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Save your speeches, Mr. Johnson. This isn't some big city courtroom where theatrics win cases. Here, we deal with facts, and the fact is, you're guilty." With that, he reached for his gavel and delivered the verdict, a $500 fine. The sound echoed through the room, final and unforgiving. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen, stunned by the blatant disregard for fairness. He glanced around the courtroom, noticing the sympathetic looks from a few spectators, mixed with the smug expressions of others. It was clear that this wasn't just about one traffic violation. It was about something much deeper, something rooted in bias and prejudice. As Marcus stepped back to his seat, he realized this wasn't going to end here. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about challenging the system, exposing the flaws within it, and proving that justice should never bow to ignorance or prejudice. Little did Judge Whittaker know, his hasty decision would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't imagine. After delivering the verdict, Judge Whittaker leaned back in his chair, his expression one of finality. The gavel had fallen, and as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. He glanced toward Marcus, perhaps expecting him to nod reluctantly, pay the fine, and leave the courtroom like so many others before him. But Marcus wasn't like the others, and this moment wasn't over yet. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady but commanding enough to draw everyone's attention. "Before I go, may I say something?" The judge hesitated for a brief second, then gave a curt nod. "Proceed," he said, though his tone suggested impatience. Marcus took a step forward, his posture confident and measured. "Your Honor, my name is Marcus Johnson, and I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The words hung in the air like thunderclaps, reverberating through the otherwise silent courtroom. Gasps rippled through the audience, and even the court clerk paused mid-note-taking, her pen hovering above the paper. Judge Whittaker froze, his eyes widening slightly as the weight of Marcus's statement sank in. For a man who prided himself on being fair and impartial, the realization that he had just fined and insulted a high-ranking legal professional hit him like a freight train. His face flushed red, though whether from embarrassment or anger was unclear. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no immediate words. Marcus continued, his tone calm but firm. "I understand that judges have difficult jobs, and I respect the role you play in upholding the law. However, Your Honor, your decision today was not based on facts or fairness. It was influenced by assumptions about who I am and what I represent. That kind of bias undermines the very foundation of justice." The courtroom fell utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Every eye was on Judge Whittaker now, waiting to see how he would respond. Some spectators exchanged nervous glances, while others sat rigidly, captivated by the unfolding drama. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension crackling in the room. Whittaker cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. "Mr. Johnson," he stammered, his usual gruffness replaced by an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "If what you say is true, then, well, I assure you, this court treats all individuals equally under the law." His words sounded hollow, even to his own ears, and Marcus didn't let them slide. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Marcus replied, "the way you spoke to me earlier tells a different story. You dismissed my explanation without consideration, and made comments that implied I was trying to make excuses. Would you have treated someone else in the same position the same way? Or did my appearance influence your judgment?" The question struck Whittaker like a dagger. He stared at Marcus, his mind racing. Was this young man right? Had he allowed implicit biases to cloud his judgment? As much as Whittaker wanted to deny it, deep down, he knew there was truth in Marcus's words. This wasn't the first time he'd been accused of favoritism or prejudice, though he had always brushed off such criticisms as baseless complaints. Now, faced with irrefutable evidence of his own shortcomings, he couldn't ignore the accusations any longer. For a moment, Whittaker considered doubling down, insisting that Marcus was misinterpreting his actions. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the sincerity in Marcus's voice, or maybe it was the collective gaze of the courtroom bearing down on him. Whatever it was, Whittaker chose a different path. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Johnson," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "And if I've given you cause to doubt the fairness of this court, I regret that deeply. I will review your case further and ensure that justice is served appropriately." It wasn't a full apology, but it was a start. And for Marcus, it was enough. As Marcus gathered his things and prepared to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a step toward exposing the cracks in a system that often went unchecked. And as he walked out of the courtroom, he knew this wouldn't be the last time Judge Whittaker heard from him. By the time Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, word of what had transpired inside was already spreading like wildfire. A young journalist named Lisa Harper, who had been covering routine cases for the local newspaper, couldn't believe her luck when she overheard snippets of the exchange between Marcus and Judge Whittaker. Sensing the story's potential, she quickly jotted down notes and approached a few spectators for their reactions. By evening, her article titled "Judge Whittaker's Bias Exposed. Federal Prosecutor Fined in Shocking Courtroom Incident" went live online. The response was immediate and explosive. Social media platforms lit up as people shared Lisa's article, adding their own commentary and outrage. Some praised Marcus for his poise and courage, calling him a real-life hero who stood up against systemic injustice. Others directed their anger toward Judge Whittaker, labeling him as a relic of outdated thinking. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #BiasInCourt trended locally, drawing attention from activists, lawyers, and even national news outlets. But not everyone sided with Marcus. A vocal minority defended Judge Whittaker, arguing that the incident was being blown out of proportion. "It was just a traffic ticket," one commenter wrote. "Why are we turning this into a race issue?" Another added, "Judges make tough calls every day. Are we going to crucify them all because someone feels offended?" These comments sparked heated debates, with some accusing the critics of ignoring the larger patterns of discrimination, while others dismissed the backlash as political correctness gone too far. Amid the chaos, Marcus found himself inundated with messages. Friends and colleagues reached out to offer support, many sharing stories of similar experiences they'd faced. Strangers sent heartfelt notes thanking him for speaking out, saying his actions gave them hope that change was possible. One message, in particular, stood out. A woman recounted how she had once been treated unfairly in Judge Whittaker's courtroom and thanked Marcus for shining a light on the problem. Reading these messages filled Marcus with a mix of emotions: pride, gratitude, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. He realized that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about giving a voice to those who had long been silenced. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted on Judge Whittaker. Local officials demanded answers, and state representatives began discussing whether an investigation into his conduct was warranted. Calls for his removal from the bench grew louder, with petitions circulating online gathering thousands of signatures. The once revered judge now faced the very real possibility of losing the career he had spent decades building. Yet, amidst the public outcry, there were also quieter conversations happening behind closed doors. Longtime residents of the town, including some who had appeared before Whittaker in the past, started reflecting on their own interactions with him. Had they ever witnessed bias? Were there signs they had overlooked or excused because it didn't directly affect them? These questions lingered uncomfortably in the air, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their community. For Marcus, the whirlwind of attention was both empowering and exhausting. While he appreciated the solidarity, he knew the fight was far from over. This wasn't just about holding one judge accountable. It was about dismantling the biases embedded within the system itself. As he scrolled through the endless stream of comments and headlines, Marcus felt a renewed determination to see this through. What started as a simple traffic stop had become a catalyst for something much bigger, and he was ready to seize the opportunity to drive meaningful change. Judge Harold Whittaker sat alone in his dimly lit study that evening, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him like a storm cloud. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall, its rhythmic sound amplifying the chaos swirling in his mind. For decades, he had prided himself on being a fair and impartial judge, a man who upheld the law without favor or prejudice. But now, faced with undeniable evidence of his own bias, he couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that he had failed not only Marcus Johnson, but also the very principles he claimed to stand for. His wife, Evelyn, walked into the room holding a cup of tea. She placed it gently on the desk in front of him, her eyes filled with concern. "Harold," she said softly, "you can't keep ignoring this. People are talking, and they're not going to stop until you address it." Her voice wasn't accusatory, but there was a firmness to it that made Whittaker glance up at her. "I know," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "But what am I supposed to do? Admit I was wrong in front of everyone. Let them drag my name through the mud." His frustration bubbled to the surface, though it was clear he was more upset with himself than anyone else. Evelyn pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "Harold, pride won't fix this. You've always taught me that admitting when you're wrong is a sign of strength, not weakness. If you don't say something, and mean it, this will haunt you forever." Her words struck a chord. Whittaker thought back to his early days as a young lawyer, full of idealism and a genuine desire to make a difference. Over time, he had become jaded by the bureaucracy and monotony of the legal system, allowing cynicism to creep in. And that cynicism blinded him to his own biases. He hated to admit it, but deep down, he knew the answer was yes. The next morning, Whittaker found himself pacing nervously in his office at the courthouse. Reporters were camped outside, eager for a statement. State officials had already begun discussing disciplinary action, and petitions calling for his removal were gaining traction online. The pressure was mounting, but what terrified him most was the idea of losing the respect of his peers and himself. As he wrestled with his thoughts, a memory surfaced. A conversation years ago with a colleague who had confessed to making racially insensitive remarks during a trial. At the time, Whittaker had dismissed the incident, telling his friend, "We're all human. We make mistakes." Now those same words echoed in his ears, forcing him to confront his hypocrisy. If he believed in second chances then, why couldn't he extend one to himself now? Finally, after hours of internal debate, Whittaker reached a decision. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for Marcus Johnson's office. When Marcus's assistant answered, Whittaker cleared his throat and said, "This is Judge Harold Whittaker. I'd like to request a private meeting with Mr. Johnson if he's available." There was a long pause on the other end before the assistant replied cautiously, "I'll see if he's free and get back to you, Your Honor." Whittaker hung up, his heart pounding. He didn't know how Marcus would respond, or if he would agree to meet at all. But he realized this was a risk he had to take. Redemption wouldn't come easily, but it was a path he needed to walk. As he waited for a response, Whittaker began drafting an apology in his mind, rehearsing the words over and over. He knew it wouldn't undo the harm he had caused, but it was a start, a chance to prove that even someone in his position could learn, grow, and strive to be better. For the first time in days, Whittaker felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about saving his reputation. It was about reclaiming the values he once held dear. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was also about bridging the gap between two men who, despite their differences, shared a common goal: justice. The day of the meeting arrived, and Marcus Johnson wasn't sure what to expect. When he received Judge Whittaker's request for a private conversation, his first instinct was skepticism. Could this be genuine, or was it just an attempt to save face? After some deliberation, Marcus decided to hear the judge out. If nothing else, it would give him insight into how someone in power grappled with accountability, a rare opportunity that could shape the broader conversation about justice and reform. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room at the courthouse, far from prying eyes and microphones. Judge Whittaker stood near the door as Marcus entered, his tall frame slightly hunched, betraying his unease. For a moment, neither man spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of their roles, and the events leading up to this moment hanging heavily in the room. "Mr. Johnson," Whittaker began, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know my actions have caused you harm, and for that, I am deeply sorry." He paused, searching Marcus's face for any sign of reaction. Marcus crossed his arms and studied the judge carefully. "Your apology is appreciated, Your Honor, but words alone won't undo the damage done. What matters now is what you do next." Whittaker nodded, visibly swallowing his pride. "I understand. This situation has forced me to confront things about myself that I'd rather not admit, biases I didn't even realize I had. It's humbling and painful, but necessary." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please sit. I'd like to explain where I'm coming from." As they sat down, Whittaker opened up in a way Marcus hadn't anticipated. He spoke candidly about his early career, when he genuinely believed he was making a difference in the legal system. Over time, however, burnout and frustration had hardened him, causing him to rely on stereotypes instead of facts. "I let cynicism cloud my judgment," Whittaker admitted. "And because of that, I failed. Not just you, but everyone who depends on judges to be fair and impartial." Marcus listened intently, his expression unreadable. While part of him wanted to remain guarded, another part recognized the sincerity in Whittaker's tone. This wasn't the defensive, dismissive man from the courtroom. This was someone willing to acknowledge his flaws and seek redemption. Still, Marcus knew actions spoke louder than words. "What are you planning to do moving forward?" Marcus asked pointedly. "An apology is one thing, but real change requires effort and accountability." Whittaker leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "That's why I wanted to speak with you. I've already enrolled in anti-bias training programs and plan to implement new procedures in my courtroom to ensure every defendant is treated fairly. But I also want to go further, to use my position to educate others about these issues. That's where I hope you might help." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How so?" "I believe we can work together," Whittaker continued. "You've experienced firsthand how bias plays out in the justice system. Together, we could create initiatives to address these problems, not just here in our town, but potentially statewide. Public forums, workshops, mentorship programs, anything that fosters understanding and promotes fairness." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. He weighed the proposal carefully, considering both its potential impact and the risks involved. Collaborating with Judge Whittaker could invite criticism, with some accusing him of letting the judge off too easily. Yet Marcus also saw an opportunity, a chance to turn this incident into something transformative. Finally, Marcus nodded. "If you're serious about this, I'm willing to help. But understand, Your Honor, this isn't about clearing your conscience. It's about creating lasting change. If you falter, I won't hesitate to call you out." Whittaker met his gaze, determination replacing the earlier uncertainty. "Fair enough. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I promise you this. I'll do everything in my power to make amends, not just to you, but to the community I serve." As the two men shook hands, a tentative alliance formed. Though their journey was just beginning, they both understood that this partnership represented more than personal reconciliation. It symbolized hope for a broken system yearning for repair. In the weeks following their private meeting, Judge Harold Whittaker threw himself into his promise of change with a level of dedication that surprised even those closest to him. He began attending anti-bias training sessions, sitting quietly in the back of rooms filled with younger judges and court staff who were eager to learn. At first, some participants eyed him warily, unsure if he was there out of genuine commitment or simply to save face. But as Whittaker actively participated, asking thoughtful questions and sharing personal reflections, it became clear that he was serious about growth. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson worked alongside Whittaker to design a series of community initiatives aimed at addressing systemic biases within the justice system. Their collaboration wasn't without challenges. There were moments when Whittaker's old habits resurfaced, such as dismissing an idea too quickly or defaulting to traditional methods. Each time, Marcus gently but firmly reminded him of their shared goal: fairness for all. Slowly but surely, Whittaker adapted, learning to listen more and assume less. One of their first projects was a public forum titled Justice Without Bias, held in the town's largest community center. The event drew a diverse crowd: local residents, law enforcement officers, attorneys, and even students curious about how the legal system worked. Marcus opened the discussion by recounting his own experience, not to shame Whittaker, but to highlight how implicit bias could affect anyone, regardless of intent. His words resonated deeply, especially among audience members who had felt marginalized by the system. When it was Whittaker's turn to speak, he stood nervously at the podium, gripping the sides tightly. "I've spent most of my life believing I was doing the right thing," he admitted, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But recently, I learned that good intentions aren't enough. We must actively work to identify our biases and correct them, not just once, but every single day." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in years, Whittaker felt a flicker of pride, not in himself, but in the possibility of real progress. The forum sparked a wave of interest across the county. Local schools invited Marcus and Whittaker to speak to students about careers in law and the importance of integrity in leadership. Community groups organized workshops where citizens could ask questions and share concerns about their interactions with the justice system. Even other judges began reaching out to Whittaker, seeking advice on how to implement similar reforms in their own courtrooms. Whittaker also introduced new policies in his courtroom designed to promote equity. He mandated that all defendants be given ample opportunity to present their side of the story before rulings were made. Additionally, he created a feedback system allowing individuals to report any perceived unfairness during proceedings, a move that initially drew resistance from fellow judges, but eventually gained support as its benefits became evident. As these efforts gained momentum, Marcus noticed a subtle shift in the way people viewed Judge Whittaker. Once criticized as stubborn and out of touch, he was now seen as a leader willing to confront uncomfortable truths. While some skeptics remained, many acknowledged that his actions spoke louder than his past mistakes. For Marcus, seeing this transformation unfold was deeply rewarding. It reinforced his belief that meaningful change required both courage and collaboration. Together, he and Whittaker proved that redemption wasn't reserved for perfect people. It was available to anyone willing to put in the hard work. And as they continued their mission, they inspired others to join them, creating ripples of hope in a system long overdue for reform. Through their unlikely partnership, Marcus and Whittaker demonstrated that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about fostering understanding, accountability, and trust. Their journey showed that even the deepest divides could be bridged when two people committed themselves to a common purpose. Months after their initial meeting, Marcus Johnson and Judge Harold Whittaker stood side by side on a stage in front of a packed auditorium. The room buzzed with anticipation as people from all walks of life gathered to hear their story, a tale of confrontation, accountability, and transformation. Students, activists, lawyers, and even local politicians filled the seats, eager to learn how two men who started as adversaries have become partners in the fight for justice. Marcus stepped up to the microphone first, his calm demeanor commanding the room's attention. "When I walked into that courtroom months ago," he began, "I didn't expect to walk out with anything more than a hefty fine and a lesson about bias. But what happened instead changed not only my perspective, but also the way we think about fairness in our legal system." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Judge Whittaker made a mistake. There's no denying that. But what sets him apart is that he chose to acknowledge it and take action. That takes courage, humility, and a willingness to grow. And in doing so, he reminded us all that change is possible, even in places where it seems least likely." The audience erupted into applause, many nodding in agreement. Marcus gestured for quiet before introducing Whittaker. As the judge approached the podium, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Once met with skepticism and criticism, Whittaker now commanded respect, not because of his title, but because of the journey he had undertaken. "Thank you," Whittaker said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "A few months ago, I would have told you that being a judge meant knowing everything about fairness and justice. Today, I know better. I've learned that true justice isn't about handing down verdicts. It's about listening, learning, and adapting. It's about recognizing when you're wrong and having the strength to make things right." He went on to share specific examples of how his courtroom practices had evolved, from giving defendants more time to present their cases to implementing training programs for court staff. "These changes didn't happen overnight," he admitted. "They required hard work, patience, and most importantly, trust from people like Mr. Johnson, who could have easily walked away but chose to help instead." As Whittaker spoke, Marcus watched the audience closely. Some wiped away tears, moved by the judge's honesty. Others scribbled notes, inspired by the practical steps they could take in their own communities. By the end of Whittaker's speech, the room felt electric with possibility. Afterward, during the Q&A session, audience members lined up to ask questions. One young woman, barely out of high school, stood nervously at the microphone. "What advice would you give to someone like me, who wants to make a difference but feels powerless?" she asked. Marcus smiled warmly. "Start small," he replied. "Change begins with awareness. Speak up when something doesn't feel right. Educate yourself and others. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. Find allies who share your vision and build bridges instead of walls." Whittaker nodded in agreement. "And don't be afraid to challenge authority, including mine," he added with a self-deprecating chuckle. "Accountability works both ways. If we want a fairer world, we need everyone to hold each other to higher standards." By the time the event ended, the energy in the room was palpable. People lingered, exchanging ideas and contact information, determined to carry the message forward. For Marcus and Whittaker, this moment wasn't just the culmination of months of effort. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As they left the auditorium together, Marcus turned to Whittaker with a smile. "You've come a long way, Your Honor. I'm proud of what we've accomplished." Whittaker chuckled softly, his expression thoughtful. "We couldn't have done it without each other. And honestly, I think we're just getting started." Their partnership proved that real change required more than pointing fingers. It demanded empathy, collaboration, and a shared commitment to growth. Together, they showed that even in the face of prejudice and misunderstanding, redemption, and progress were always within reach.